Well, is it dated then to use Marxist as a political slur? Aaron Bastani is a founder of the left-wing platform Novara Media. He's the author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism, and he's a Marxist. Tom Harwood is a reporter for Guido Fawkes, and he is not. Good afternoon to you both.
Afternoon.
Afternoon.
Aaron Bastani, I imagine you're proud, presumably, to be called a Marxist.
I'm proud to be someone who doesn't just willfully write off any thinker within the Western canon of political economy. Karl Marx had a great deal to say about capitalism and its shortcomings, just as did John Maynard Keynes, Jevons, and of course you can go further back. There's validity in the writings of Adam Smith, Ricardo. And so I think that willful ignorance, which the Tories wear so lightly, is something I absolutely don't want to be a part of. No, Karl Marx's conclusions were very relevant for the 21st century.
OK, Tom Harwood, do you see it as a term of abuse?
I think it should be. I think anyone who's followed the history of any country that has followed the doctrines of Karl Marx and followed the writings and tried to implement the conclusions has opened up unthought, untold misery on hundreds of millions of people. Any country that tries to impose those solutions as they see them inevitably requires the heavy-handed arm of the state to come down on the individual. And that means, I mean, we've seen it tried time and time again in any continent, in any country, in any culture. It has always failed, and it has always brought death and misery and destruction and poverty. And I think it is right that politicians call that out and try and prevent it from coming here. How
do you respond to that, Aaron Bastani?
Well, it's just simply not true. If Tom can be grateful enough to just point me to where Karl Marx talks about those things, I'd be happy to answer his misgivings, but that's simply not true. Karl Marx explicitly said, I'm not here to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. Capital was called Capital, a critique of political economy. He was critiquing the classical political economy of David Ricardo, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill. And what we need to remember is actually he wasn't unique as a political economist in thinking that capitalism had an end. This was a very normal thing in the 19th century. We know, obviously, Thomas Malthus said this in regards to overpopulation. That was incorrect. David Ricardo also said something quite similar in regards to the eventual scarcity of peat as a fossil fuel. In a strange way, he was also right. It was a very common thing to think that capitalism is a socially contingent system. It has a beginning and an end. And this fanaticism that it has no end, that we can have eternal compound growth, really, I think, belies intellectual inadequacy on the behalf of modern conservatism.
Marx was an interesting philosopher because he didn't really see himself as a philosopher. He saw himself more as a scientist, as someone trying to describe the world as he saw it. But what's interesting about that is that every prediction he made turned out to be untrue. He said that inevitably, as we industrialised, as more capitalism came into being, as markets became freer, there'd be higher unemployment, there'd be a greater disparity of wealth between rich and poor, there would be all of these problems. And actually, the exact opposite is happening. Actually, global inequality is falling. Actually, we've never been more wealthy as a society. Fewer people now are living in absolute poverty than ever before. For the first time ever, it's fallen below 10% of the world living in absolute poverty. As more market economies have developed, as more countries have moved towards capitalism, we've seen untold growth and riches, and that's a good thing.
Can I ask you both, do you think that there is a generational thing here, that actually, Tom Harwood, if you want to engage and take on Marxists, that you need to engage just as you did there with the arguments rather than considering it a term of abuse? Because actually there's a lot of younger generation who don't really understand why it would be abusive.
I don't think there's any evidence to support that. Every generation there have been young voices, particularly university students or people who purport to represent university students, have been traditionally seen as being more left-wing. And yet the country as a whole doesn't become more left-wing as time goes on. The people that have the loudest voices tend to be these kind of radical Marxist, almost communist forces. But actually they're not that representative of the country as a whole. We heard that there was a youth quake in 2017. Actually, the data and the political science suggests that that wasn't true. Turnout amongst young people to vote in the last election wasn't any higher than in 2015.
Well, Aaron Bastani, do you see a different generational thing?
Yeah, I do, and I don't understand what representation has to do with anything. John Maynard Keynes wasn't representative of most people in Britain in the 1930s and 1940s. Ultimately, the economies of Western Europe went down a path which reflected his ideas. In terms of young people and their radicalism, often, yes, people have ideas and they don't know where to attribute it. That could be left, that can be right, that can be in regard to any number of things. But I do think that younger people, and Tom is right, that a great deal of things have changed in the last 25 years. China in particular has taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. If Tom thinks that China is a market capitalist economy, well, we'll just have to disagree.
Well, I'm sorry, but they have followed market reforms.
Tom, I didn't interrupt you. Sorry, can I just finish my point?
Sure, of course.
Thank you. And in terms of younger people in this country, they are, I think, leaning and tending towards more left-wing ideas. Public ownership, by the way, isn't a particularly radical idea in the context of British political history. It's not a Marxist idea by any stretch. They're leaning towards those ideas because of their material conditions. And this is perhaps the most important thing Marx can teach us.
Just briefly.
His historical method was that forms of consciousness and social relations are an outgrowth of extant economic relations and technologies. People feel the way they do, not because they've been persuaded of one thing or the other, because of their economic experiences.
Tom Harwood.
Young people today are probably the most pro-free market generation we have ever seen. They're the most likely to want to start a business. They're the most likely to want to go out and engage with the economy. They're the most likely to be using the sharing economy, new apps, new innovations. All of this is capitalism, and people in the media and politics need to do a better job of explaining what capitalism is. It isn't a remote system of bankers working. It is us, everyone participating in the economy. And it's delivered such wealth and good news for the country and the world as a whole.
Tom Harwood and Aaron Bastani, thank you both very much for coming on to argue the case.